Gladiator II is directed by Ridley Scott, written by David Scarpa, David Franzoni, and Peter Craig, and stars Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, Pedro Pascal, Connie Nielsen, Joseph Quinn, and Fred Hechinger. And it follows Lucius, who, after his home is conquered by the tyrannical emperors who now lead Rome, is forced to enter the Colosseum and must look to his past to find strength to return the glory of Rome to its people. My anticipation of this movie was really up and down. You know, when they first announced it and when the first trailers were coming out, I had no relationship to the first as I had never seen it. So I just saw the trailer and I was like, oh, that looks like a cool, epic Ridley Scott movie. Then as time went on, it built up Oscar buzz and crafts categories, Denzel, and maybe Best Picture. And then just a couple nights ago, I watched the first one for the first time and loved it. And that added to my momentum and the high I was feeling. And I didn't even know that I'd be seeing the second one the very next night. You know, I got even more momentum because I saw this through AMC's Screen Unseen program, which is usually much smaller movies that need a bit of a push, but this time they went with Gladiator II, I think hoping to build up some buzz to compete against Wicked. So being in that theater and seeing Gladiator II early just added to it. You know, I was really excited going into this movie, but when I walked out of it, I ultimately left the movie feeling pretty cold and in the middle, and that this isn't really on the same level as the first one at all. And I did wonder if me watching the first one so closely to this one's release kind of negatively impacted it. You know, comparison is the thief of joy and all that, but I don't think that's really out of place because this movie really does want to remind you of the first one, and I'll expand on that in a bit. But I want to start with the positive here. There's really incredible crafts here, as you would expect. You know, production design, costume design, VFX, these are all great. Ridley Scott is bringing back some of the team from the first one. You've got Arthur Max doing the production design again, and John Matheson doing the cinematography. Kind of mixed results there. I think the cinematography is kind of wanting here. The production design is great, and then the score is, I think, fine, but honestly totally unmemorable. Hans Zimmer is very missed, but, you know, this is also, at the end of the day, a Ridley Scott movie. And although I have issues with his directing in many other areas of the movie, he still does pretty freaking great work in the big battle and action scenes because he's freaking Ridley Scott. Those sequences were by far the most engaging and exciting of the movie for me, and anytime they happened, I was locked in because this movie also brings that unflinching violence from the first one back. To see that carried over here was a big relief to me. And you've got maybe the best element of the movie overall, Denzel Washington, who is doing fantastic work here and ultimately steals the movie because, well, he's Denzel. He's definitely looking good for an Oscar nomination, if you ask me, and I was honestly a bit surprised by the size of his role. He ends up playing a bigger part in the story than I initially thought, and that was such a pleasant surprise because he's clearly having so much fun and is so activated here. Every time he's on screen, I couldn't take my eyes off him as he is bringing so much dimension and personality to his performance that just can't really be found anywhere else in the movie. And I think that kind of leads me into what is the biggest issue with this movie, which is there are so many underwritten characters, which leads to a lot of performances that simply aren't compelling, and that starts with Paul Mescal. You know, the movie sort of lives or dies in this performance, and Mescal just doesn't have the goods for this type of performance. You know, watching this movie, it's still very clear that he's a good actor, but he doesn't have that magical mix of magnetism and stoicism that Russell Crowe had to pull off this performance. And, you know, not that I would want or expect him to just fully recreate the Russell Crowe performance, but you need that kind of energy to lead a movie like this, and Mescal just doesn't have it. You know, it's mainly exemplified by a moment that I believe is in the trailers, where he's talking to Denzel, and Denzel is like, I see an incredible rage in you, it's spilling out of you like milk. And they cut to Paul Mescal, and in that moment, I didn't see rage, I saw, like, boredom and sadness. And I think that's where it crumbles, is you don't believe that this guy just needs this more than anything in the world like you did with Russell Crowe. And because this lead performance is like that and doesn't have that heart or emotion or X factor that Russell Crowe's performance had, the movie kind of falls apart around it a little bit. You know, Pedro Pascal is here, and he's also pretty bland. He also, though, is very underwritten and doesn't get too much to work with. His character should have been really interesting, but he just isn't. It feels a lot to me like they just took Maximus and split him into Paul Mescal and Pedro Pascal's characters and just made two far less compelling characters, which, you know, obviously I'm not a fan of. And this issue is kind of the same with Joseph Quinn and Fred Hechinger, who are a bit more fun to watch because they're playing the wacky emperors, but again, that's all they are. There's no dimension to their characters, whereas Commodus in the first one is this terrible, terrible rat person, and yet he has this incredible, like, mental health issue where his father has not loved him for his entire life, and it makes that character a lot more exciting to watch, and that just isn't here. And that's the same thing with the connections to the first one through roles like Connie Nielsen or Derek Jacobi, who just don't really have any real purpose and just kind of feel like they're like, hey, remember us? I mean, Derek Jacobi literally has one line, which was very frustrating to me. And this movie is really obsessed with being very similar to the first one, constantly reminding you of the first one. And that's not automatically a bad thing. I've liked movies that have done that before, like The Force Awakens. But here, there's no heart or emotion or X factor. I know I mentioned that before with Crowe's performance, but that stretches to the movie. It doesn't have those things that took the first one to the next level and made it stand out more than a normal sword and sandals epic. And that kind of leads to this one feeling like kind of a cheap imitator a little bit. You know, you don't have that same energy or exactness from Ridley Scott behind the camera that you had in the first one. And obviously this is a man who's 25 years older, but it just feels like a different director to me. And, you know, there is all that emotion and heart in the first one that builds and builds across the movie to one of the most satisfying endings ever in cinema. And not that I'm expecting Ridley Scott to just bring that again, but that emotion and heart just ultimately isn't there. And, you know, I don't mind a movie rehashing an earlier franchise entry, but Gladiator ultimately just did it in a way that was so non-compelling that it failed for me in that area, and as a result kind of led to the movie failing a bit for me as a whole. I ultimately didn't really like Gladiator II. I'm just so on this movie. In spite of my thought that watching the first so close to this might have negatively impacted my viewing experience a bit, this movie is still just lacking. Largely uncompelling performances and a heavily underwritten script lead to this movie being in desperate need of some heart and emotion and soul that it just cannot muster up. It feels like Ridley is really trying to recreate the magic of the first by bringing the crew back together and kind of rehashing the story a lot and kind of forcing it to be as good as the first when it just doesn't. It doesn't have those elements that made the first one so special, and ultimately, for me, this movie did just kind of blend in as a sword and sandals epic. There is still some good here, like I said. Denzel is very fun to watch. There's really good crafts, and I do think many other people will be more entertained by this than I was, but ultimately, I just wasn't. I would still recommend it because it's a follow-up to a modern classic by a master filmmaker, and, you know, you'll probably have a good time at the movies with it, even if I didn't. So yeah, I would still recommend Gladiator II. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye!